They were told to close their eyes and not scream when the American doctors came. 32 Japanese women stood in the Texas heat that September morning, convinced they were about to be dissected alive. One woman clutched a sharpened stone in her hand, not to defend herself, but to end her own life before the torture began. What happened instead would shatter everything they believed about their enemy. September 15, 1945. Camp Swift Bastrop, County, Texas. The temperature had already climbed to 95 degrees by 9 in the morning, and the dust hung in the air like a curtain between these women and their fate. The medical tent loomed ahead, its canvas walls rippling in the hot wind. Through the open flap, they could see metal tables, surgical instruments catching the light, American doctors in white coats moving between stations. Everything they had been told was about to come true. Margaret Hayashi stood fifth in line, her fingers wrapped around the sharp stone hidden in the pocket of her torn dress. She was 23 years old, though she felt ancient. 5 months ago, she had been a telephone operator in Naha, Okinawa, routing calls for the Japanese military command. 3 months ago, she had been hiding in limestone caves while American battleships turned her island into a nightmare of fire and steel. 6 weeks ago, she had been captured by United States Marines who looked at her with faces she could not read. And now she stood in the heart of Texas waiting to die. The whisper started at the front of the line and passed from woman to woman like a prayer. Close your eyes and don't scream. Close your eyes and don't scream. The phrase reached Margaret and she mouthed it silently, tasting the words. Behind her, 19-year-old Emma Lou was crying without making a sound, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face. Ahead of her, Grace Watanabe stood perfectly still, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Grace was 32, a teacher, a mother. She had left 2 children with her aunt on the mainland before the invasion. Margaret wondered if Grace was thinking about them now, about whether they would ever know what happened to their mother in this place. The propaganda posters from the caves were still vivid in Margaret's mind. She could see them even with her eyes open. American soldiers with demonic faces, their hands dripping blood. Japanese text warning that Americans ate human flesh, that American doctors use prisoners for medical experiments, that capture men of fate worse than death. Every woman in this line had seen those posters. Every woman believed them. Why wouldn't they? Their own government had told them these things. Their own military commanders had ordered them to die rather than surrender. And yet, here they stood, alive, captured, waiting for the proof. An American nurse emerged from the tent. She was young, perhaps 30, with red hair that gleamed like copper in the harsh Texas sun. She wore a clean white uniform with a red cross on the armband, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle. Medical examination, she said in halting Japanese. For your health. Necessary for disease check. Her accent was terrible, the words clumsy in her mouth, but the meaning was clear enough. Margaret's stomach twisted. Disease check. That's what they would call it. That's how they would justify what came next. She gripped the stone tighter, feeling its sharp edge bite into her palm. When the pain became too much, when she could no longer bear what they were going to do, she would use it. One quick motion across her wrist, and it would be over. Better that than whatever waited inside that tent. The journey to this moment had begun 3 weeks ago, though it felt like years. After Japan's surrender on August 15th, the American Marines on Okinawa had rounded up all the Japanese civilians who had worked with the military. Not soldiers, but support staff. Telephone operators like Margaret. Teachers conscripted to work in military offices like Grace. Young girls who had been forced to serve as nurses and messengers like Emma. They were not combatants, but they had worn Japanese military identification badges. And so they became prisoners of war. The Americans had processed them through a facility in Hawaii first. That's where Margaret's confusion had begun. They had expected immediate execution or torture, but instead they were given medical checkups, clean clothes and food. Real food, rice and fish and vegetables. It made no sense. Why would the enemy feed prisoners they planned to kill? The women whispered among themselves, trying to understand. It must be a trick, the older women said. They are fattening us up. They want us healthy before the experiments begin. Then came the voyage across the Pacific. 2 weeks on a transport ship cramped into cargo holds, but not beaten, not starved, not thrown overboard as the propaganda had promised. The American sailors mostly ignored them, going about their work with an efficiency that seemed almost bored. A few tried to speak to them using hand gestures and broken Japanese phrases from military handbooks. One sailor, a boy who looked barely 18, had shown Margaret a photograph of his family. His mother and father standing in front of a white house with a porch, his little sister holding a dog. See, he had said, pointing to himself in the photo, home, family, like you. Margaret had not known what to make of this. The propaganda had never mentioned that Americans had families, that they took photographs, that they smiled in those photographs like normal human beings. The ship had docked in San Francisco. Margaret caught only a glimpse of the city from the porthole, but what she saw staggered her. Buildings tall as mountains, intact and gleaming. Streets full of cars. No bomb craters, no burned-out ruins, no starving refugees. The war had not touched this place at all. How was that possible? Japan had been fighting with everything it had, sacrificing everything, and America looked like the war had been nothing more than a distant rumor. From San Francisco, they took a train. 3 days and 2 nights across a landscape so vast Margaret could not comprehend it. Endless plains that stretched to the horizon. Mountains that made Okinawa's hills look like children's toys. Fields of wheat and corn that went on for miles, perfect and untouched. Cities and towns flashing past the windows, all intact, all prosperous, all impossible. This was the enemy, this giant, this colossus that their leaders had told them Japan could defeat. And then Texas. They arrived at Camp Swift on a hot afternoon, the train pulling into a siding near the town of Bastrop. American soldiers loaded them onto trucks and drove them through the main gate. The camp had been built during the war to house German and Italian prisoners, the American guards explained through translators. Now those prisoners were gone, sent home, or kept at other facilities, and the barracks were being used for Japanese civilians awaiting repatriation. Repatriation. The word hung in the air like a promise or a threat. You will go home eventually, the Americans said, but first processing, first medical examinations, first work assignments. Margaret did not believe the repatriation part. Why would the Americans send them home? It made no sense. This had to be a delay tactic, a psychological game to make them compliant before the real horror began. Camp Swift sprawled across the Texas landscape like a small city. Rows of wooden barracks painted olive green, motor pools full of trucks and jeeps, administrative buildings with the American flag hanging limp in the still air, guard towers at the corners of the compound, though Margaret noticed the guards seemed more interested in smoking cigarettes than watching prisoners. The fence was barbed wire, yes, but it looked almost decorative compared to the fortifications she had seen in Okinawa. Everything about this place felt temporary, casual, as if the Americans had not really decided what to do with them yet. The smell was the first thing that truly unsettled her. Not the smell of death or decay or fear, but the smell of food cooking. Rich, fatty food, meat frying in oil, bread baking, coffee brewing. The scents drifted across the compound from the mess hall, and Margaret's stomach betrayed her with a loud growl. She had not eaten since yesterday morning, and her body did not care about propaganda or fear or dignity. It only knew hunger. The sounds were equally wrong. American voices raised in laughter. Someone playing a harmonica. The rumble of truck engines. A radio somewhere playing music, big band jazz with horns and drums. It sounded almost festive, as if this were a summer camp and not a prison. How could the enemy be laughing? How could they be playing music? Margaret had spent the last months of the war in caves where the only sounds were explosions, screams, and whispered prayers. This casual normalcy felt obscene. Now standing in line outside the medical tent, Margaret felt the weight of that stone in her pocket. The sun beat down on her head. Sweat ran down her back, soaking through the thin fabric of her dress. The smell of antiseptic drifted from the tent, sharp and chemical. A medical smell, the smell that preceded operations and experiments and things too terrible to name. The red-haired nurse called the first woman forward, a woman in her 30s whose name Margaret did not know. She went without resistance, her face blank, already gone to some internal place where pain could not reach her. The tent flap closed behind her. The remaining women waited, listening for screams, counting the seconds, preparing themselves. But there were no screams. The silence stretched out minute after minute until it became almost more frightening than screams would have been. What were they doing in there that required such silence? Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, the first woman emerged. She was walking on her own. She was not bleeding. She was not crying. She looked confused, disoriented, as if she had expected one thing and received something completely different. In her hands, she clutched a small paper bag. What happened? The others asked, crowding around her. What did they do? The woman shook her head slowly as if trying to understand it herself. They examined me, she said. They checked my eyes and throat and heart. They found an infection in my lungs. They gave me medicine. She held up the paper bag, and Margaret could see pills inside white tablets in a clear bottle. Medicine for the infection so I can heal. This explanation satisfied no one. It had to be a trick. The medicine was probably poison. Or maybe this woman was part of the deception an actress planted to make them compliant. But the woman's confusion seemed genuine. Her hands were shaking as she held the paper bag as if she did not know whether to trust this gift or throw it away. The second woman was called, then the third. Each emerged after 10 or 15 minutes looking equally bewildered. One had bandages on her hands. Another had received ointment for a skin rash. A third had been given vitamins and instructions to eat more protein. With each woman who emerged intact, the tension in the line became more surreal. The propaganda had prepared them for torture. It had prepared them for death. It had not prepared them for this. The red-haired nurse emerged again and surveyed the remaining women. Her eyes settled on Margaret and she gestured. You next. Margaret's legs felt like water as she stepped forward. This was it. This was the moment. Her fingers found the stone in her pocket, wrapping around it. If they tried to strap her down, if they brought out surgical tools, if she saw the experiments beginning, she would use it. Quick across the wrist, deep enough to matter. She would not give them the satisfaction of her pain. But before she could enter the tent, before she could discover what waited inside, the nurse did something unexpected. Instead of leading Margaret to the examination area, she gestured to a different section of the tent separated by a canvas partition. Through the gap, Margaret could see large metal basins, and rising from those basins impossibly was steam. Hot water. The nurse made washing motions with her hands pantomiming scrubbing, face and arms. She picked up a bar of white soap from a stack nearby and held it out to Margaret. The soap was stamped with letters. Ivory. Margaret stared at it, unable to process what she was seeing. The nurse's broken Japanese came again. Clean first, then examine. Clean important for health. Margaret took the soap. It was solid in her hand, real heavier than she expected. The nurse led her closer to the basins, and Margaret could feel the heat radiating from the water. Her mind struggled to understand. Why would they give prisoners hot water and soap? What purpose could this serve? Other women were being led to the basins now. The canvas partition created a private area screened from the male doctors. The nurse demonstrated dipping her hands in the water, lathering the soap, washing her face and arms. Then she stepped back and gestured for the women to do the same. Margaret approached the basin slowly as if it might explode. She touched the water with one finger. It was hot, actually hot, heated over fires outside and brought in just for this purpose. She had not felt hot water in 5 months. Not since before the battle, before the caves, before the end of everything. The temperature alone nearly broke her. She dipped both hands in and the heat traveled up her arms into her chest, into the cold center of her where fear lived. Around her, other women were doing the same tentatively at first, then with growing wonder. The soap lathered in their hands, white foam that smelled clean, astringent, nothing like the harsh military soap they had used in Okinawa. This was good soap, expensive soap, American soap. Margaret began to wash. She scrubbed her hands, her arms, her face. 5 months of cave dirt, of smoke and fear and desperation began to dissolve. She dipped her hair into the water and used the soap to work through the tangles. The water in the basin turned gray, then black. She was washing away the battle, washing away the end of the world. Around her, women were doing the same. Some were crying now, but not from fear. From something else. Something more complicated. Emma was sobbing as she washed her young face, crumpling, as months of held tension finally released. Grace Watanabe worked in silence, methodical, thorough, as if this simple act of cleanliness was a prayer. But Ruth Kobayashi stood apart, refusing to approach the water. Ruth was 44, a military clerk who had worked in administration. This is a trick, she said loudly. They want to soften us. They want to make us forget who we are before they begin the real torture. Do not be fooled by kindness. The enemy does not offer kindness without purpose. The nurse seemed to understand the resistance, even without knowing the exact words. She approached Ruth carefully, maintaining distance, her hands open and empty. She spoke in that broken Japanese again. Your choice. No force. But doctor need clean to check for disease. Keep you safe. Keep others safe. Ruth's face was stone. I will not wash, she said. If I am to die, I will die, yes, a Japanese woman, not as someone who accepted enemy charity. The nurse nodded slowly. She did not argue. She simply stepped back and let Ruth make her choice. This perhaps more than anything else unsettled Margaret. The Americans were not forcing them. They were offering and accepting refusal. This was not how conquerors behaved. This was not how the propaganda had described the enemy at all. After the washing, clean towels were distributed. Real towels, white and soft smelling of sun. The women dried themselves slowly, still waiting for the trap to spring. Then came simple cotton dresses folded in a pile. The nurse indicated they should change out of their corn-filthy clothing. Again, a privacy screen was erected. Again, no force, only offering. Margaret put on the clean dress and felt the soft fabric against her skin. It had been washed recently, probably in the camp laundry. It smelled like detergent and starch. She stood there in the clean dress with her clean skin and her clean hair and felt her mind begin to fracture. This cannot be real, she thought. This must be a trick. They will hurt us more because we let our guard down. We should have run. We should have died first. But her body betrayed her with relief. Her skin felt air for the first time in months. The weight of grime was gone. She felt lighter, younger, almost human again. And that feeling terrified her more than torture would have. Because if the Americans could make her feel human, what did that say about everything she had been taught? The nurse now gestured toward the examination area. One at a time, Margaret was still first. She walked through the canvas partition into a space with cots, medical equipment, and 3 American doctors in white coats. One was a woman, tall and red-haired like the nurse. The other 2 were men older with tired faces. They looked up as Margaret entered, and the woman doctor smiled. Actually smiled. The expression was genuine, reaching her eyes, crinkling the corners. Hello, the doctor said in English. Then through the translator who stood nearby, a young Japanese-American woman, the doctor's words came in Japanese. My name is Dr. Kate Martinez. I am going to check your health. This will not hurt. I promise. The translator introduced herself quietly. I'm Betty Tanaka. I'm from Sacramento. My family was interned at Manzanar during the war. When the Army asked for volunteers to help with Japanese prisoners of war, I thought maybe I could bridge something, help both sides see each other clearly. Her voice carried no bitterness, only quiet determination. Margaret looked at her with new understanding. You were imprisoned by your own country, Betty nodded. And now I'm helping former enemies of my country. War makes strange sense sometimes. Promises. The doctor was making promises. Margaret stood frozen, her hand still in her pocket, still gripping the stone. Dr. Martinez gestured to a cot. Please sit. I need to examine your eyes first. Check for disease. Then throat, heart, lungs. Basic medical procedure. Basic medical procedure. The words were so ordinary, so bureaucratic, that they seemed absurd in this context. Margaret sat on the cot because she did not know what else to do. Her mind was screaming that this was the moment the torture would begin, but her body was exhausted from fear and simply surrendered to the inevitable. Dr. Martinez approached with a small light. She held it up. Look at me, please. Into the light. Margaret looked, and the doctor shone the light into each eye, examining closely. Good pupil response, she murmured to herself, making notes. No signs of jaundice. The light clicked off. Now open your mouth. Say ah. Margaret opened her mouth. The doctor leaned in with a wooden stick, pressing her tongue down gently to look at her throat. The stick tasted like wood and nothing else. Not poison, not chemicals, just wood. Throat is inflamed, Dr. Martinez said. Probably from breathing dust in caves. I will prescribe medicine to help with that. Medicine. Again with the medicine. Margaret's confusion grew with each passing second. The doctor moved to checking lymph nodes next, her fingers pressing gently against Margaret's neck, under her jaw, behind her ears. Looking for swelling, the doctor explained through Betty. Sign of infection or disease. Your glands are slightly enlarged but not dangerous. The touch was professional, careful, almost apologetic for the necessary invasion of space. Next came the stethoscope. The metal disc was cold against Margaret's chest even through the thin dress. Breathe deeply, Dr. Martinez instructed. In, out. Again. Good. Your heart rate is elevated, but that is normal given the circumstances. Lungs sound clear, no signs of tuberculosis or pneumonia. Then the doctor knelt down and took Margaret's hands. These caught her attention immediately. Margaret's hands were a mess cut and scraped and infected from months of scrabbling on cave rocks, from working without gloves, from having no medicine or bandages or care. The doctor turned them over, gently examining the damage. When did this happen, she asked. During the battle, Margaret heard herself answer. We hid in the caves, the rocks. The doctor nodded, her face serious. I'm going to clean these wounds and wrap them. It will sting a little, but then they will heal properly. Without infection, you could lose function in your fingers. The doctor poured clear liquid from a bottle over Margaret's hands. It did sting, sharp and sudden, making Margaret gasp. But then the pain faded to a mild burn, and the doctor was already moving, applying ointment, wrapping each hand in clean white bandages. Her movements were quick, practiced, efficient. The work of someone who had done this 1,000 times, who cared about the outcome. When both hands were wrapped, the doctor sat back. I need to check for internal injuries now. I will press on your stomach. Tell me if anything hurts, any pain during the battle, any bleeding that has not stopped. Margaret shook her head, unable to speak. The doctor's hands were gentle as she pressed against Margaret's abdomen, checking systematically. No rigidity, she murmured. No masses. That is good. Finally, Dr. Martinez stepped back and made notes on a clipboard. You are malnourished and dehydrated. You have several infections, but nothing that will not heal with proper care. She reached for a bag and began placing bottles inside. Vitamins. Antibiotics for the infections. Pain medicine if your hands hurt too much. Take these with meals. The camp kitchen has been instructed to provide adequate nutrition. Rice, vegetables, protein. Your body needs to recover. She handed the bag to Margaret. Then the doctor did something that shattered the last of Margaret's composure. She reached out and gently touched Margaret's shoulder. You have been through hell, Dr. Martinez said. And even though the words came through Betty, the emotion was clear. But you are safe now. No one here will hurt you. I give you my word. She paused, and when she spoke again, her Texas accent became more pronounced, as if she wanted Margaret to understand something personal. I grew up on the Texas-Mexico border, El Paso. My father was a Texas Ranger. My mother taught school in Juarez. I learned early that people are people no matter which side of a line they're born on. When the war started, I joined the Army Medical Corps, took care of American boys. Now I take care of Japanese girls. Same job, same oath. Do no harm, a word, the enemy's word. Margaret took the bag of medicine with her bandaged hands and felt something crack inside her chest. This should not be happening. The enemy should be monsters. The enemy should be cruel. But Dr. Martinez's tired eyes held only kindness, and her gentle hands had wrapped wounds that Margaret's own side had ignored for months. The examination was over. Margaret was led out of the tent, still clutching the medicine bag, her mind unable to process what had just occurred. Outside, the other women crowded around her. What happened? What did they do? Margaret looked down at her bandaged hands, at the bag of medicine, at the clean dress she wore. They examined me, she said slowly. They gave me medicine. They bandaged my wounds. They were gentle. The words sounded insane even as she said them. But the evidence was in her hands. The medicine was real. The bandages were real. The gentle touch had been real. And if all of that was real, then what did that mean about everything else they had been told? One by one, when each woman went through the same examination. Grace emerged with cough syrup for her chronic cough. Emma came out with her foot wounds cleaned and bandaged, antibiotics prescribed. Even Ruth, who had refused to wash, was examined with patience and given medicine for an eye infection. With each woman who emerged intact and cared for, the surreal atmosphere deepened. They gathered outside the tent afterward, this group of 32 Japanese women in clean dresses, holding bags of medicine, looking at each other with expressions of complete bewilderment. Someone whispered the phrase from earlier, "Close your eyes and don't scream." But now it sounded hollow, foolish. They had closed their eyes. They had prepared to scream. and instead they had been washed, examined, and healed. "What does this mean?" Grace asked quietly. Why would they do this? Ruth had no answer. Now her certainty from the night before had cracked. She clutched her medicine bag like everyone else, evidence she could not deny. Emma still had her cloth bag with the razor blade, but her hands had stopped shaking. Margaret looked down at her bandaged hands and felt tears begin to fall. "This is the cruelest trick of all," she said, "making us hope, making us think they might be human. Because if they are human, then what were we fighting? What did our fathers and brothers die fighting? What were all those deaths for?" The question hung in the Texas air unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. A young American soldier appeared barely 20 years old with the face too young for the rifle he carried. He gestured toward a line of wooden buildings in the distance. "Barracks," he said in careful Japanese, clearly learned from a phrasebook. "You sleep there. Food soon. Come." The women followed because there was nothing else to do. They walked across the dusty compound past American soldiers who glanced at them with curiosity, but no malice, past the mess hall where the smell of cooking food made their stomachs clench with hunger, past guard towers where the guards were smoking and talking rather than watching. Everything about this place contradicted everything they knew. The barracks were simple wooden structures painted olive green. Inside were rows of cots, each with a thin mattress, a pillow, and two folded blankets. At the foot of each cot was a small wooden box for personal belongings. The building had windows with screens to keep out insects. There was a ceiling fan that was not running but could be. The space was clean, swept, ready for occupants. The young soldier showed them the facilities using gestures and broken Japanese. He pointed to a nearby building. Bathroom, toilet, shower, water. He made washing motions. Then he pointed to another building. Food, eat, morning, noon, night. He held up 3 fingers to emphasize. 3 meals every day. Then he said something that stunned them all. He pointed at the door of the barracks. "No lock. You stay here, but no lock. You need something, you ask guard. Guard help." And then he left, simply turned and walked away, leaving them alone in the unlocked barracks. For a long time, no one moved. They stood in the center of the room, looking at the cots at the door with no lock at each other. Finally, Margaret walked to one of the cots and sat down. The mattress gave slightly under her weight. It was thin but softer than anything she had slept on in months. Certainly softer than cave floors or transport ship decks. She laid back carefully as if the cot might collapse. It did not. Around her, other women were doing the same, each choosing a cot, each lying down tentatively. Margaret pulled one of the blankets over herself, even though the September heat made it unnecessary. The weight of the blanket felt comforting, secure, like being held. She had not felt safe enough to sleep deeply in so long. Her body ached for rest, but her mind would not release its vigilance. As darkness fell and the sounds of the camp grew quieter, Margaret heard soft crying from several cots. Someone was praying quietly in the corner. Buddhist sutras whispered into the night. Mostly there was silence, the heavy silence of women too exhausted and confused to process their circumstances. Margaret touched her bandaged hands, gently feeling the padding, the careful wrapping. The medicine bag sat under her pillow. Tomorrow she was supposed to take the pills with breakfast. Tomorrow there would be food. Tomorrow the Americans would continue treating them with this inexplicable kindness. She pulled the notebook she had managed to keep through everything from her small box of belongings. She had been writing in it since Okinawa, documenting what happened, who died, what was lost. Now she wrote by the faint light coming through the window. September 15th, 1945. First day in American Camp, Texas. They gave us hot water. They gave us soap. They gave us medicine. Dr. Martinez wrapped my hands like they mattered. Tomorrow we eat. Tomorrow we are safe, they say. I do not believe it yet, but my hands are bandaged. That is real. If this is a trick, it is the cruelest trick of all, because hope hurts more than torture. I have hidden the sharp stone under my pillow. Just in case they were lying, and tomorrow the real horror begins. But tonight I am clean. Tonight I am warm. Tonight I am alive. And I do not understand any of it. She closed the notebook and lay back down. Sleep came slowly, fitfully, full of dreams that mixed cave darkness with clean bandages, propaganda posters with Dr. Martinez's kind eyes. When she finally slept deeply, it was the first safe sleep she had known in months. And that safety, that small taste of peace, would prove more transformative than any torture could have been. Margaret woke to a bell ringing across the camp. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The sound pulled her from dreams of caves and bombs into a reality that felt equally unreal. Sunlight streamed through the barracks windows. Around her, other women were stirring, sitting up on their cots, looking around with the same confused expressions they had worn yesterday. They were still here, still in Texas, still alive, still inexplicably safe. The young American soldier from yesterday appeared at the door. His name tag read Hughes, Private Hughes. He looked nervous, uncomfortable with his role as keeper of these enemy women. Breakfast, he said in his careful phrase book Japanese. Come eat. He gestured toward the mess hall building they had passed the day before. The women rose slowly, moving as a group. They still sought safety, and numbers still expected the trap to spring at any moment. They walked across the compound in the early morning light. The September air was already warm, promising another scorching day. American soldiers were moving about their morning routines, some jogging in formation, others heading to work, details a few standing in small groups, drinking coffee from tin cups. Several glanced at the Japanese women with curiosity, but no one stared. No one made threatening gestures. No one seemed particularly interested beyond mild surprise at seeing them. The mess hall was a long wooden building with screened windows and a corrugated metal roof. Inside, rows of tables and benches filled the space. American soldiers sat at some tables eating breakfast and talking in the casual way of men who were safe and well-fed. Other tables sat empty, clearly designated for the Japanese women. A serving line ran along one wall with large pots and trays of food behind a counter. Women in U.S. Army uniforms stood behind the counter, kitchen staff preparing to serve. As the Japanese women approached tentatively, the American servers began filling trays. Margaret watched, trying to understand what she was seeing. The first items placed on her tray were familiar. White rice, a mound of it steaming and fluffy, more rice than she had seen in 2 years. The grains were separate, perfectly cooked, not the mushy, overcooked paste or the hard, undercooked kernels they had subsisted on toward the end of the war. This was good rice, abundant rice, rice like peacetime. Next came miso soup. Margaret could smell it before she saw it. The fermented, salty, umami richness of real miso, not the thin, weak substitutes made from God knows what that the military had provided in the last months. This was actual miso soup with tofu cubes floating in it and green onion garnish on top. The warmth of the bowl in her hands felt like a memory from another life. Pickled vegetables came next. Tsukemono, daikon radish and cucumber. The salty, sour taste that every Japanese table held. How did the Americans know to make tsukemono, who had taught them, then grilled fish? Small pieces of mackerel salted and char-grilled. The skin crispy, the flesh tender. The smell triggered something deep in Margaret's memory. Breakfast in her parents' house in Naha before the war destroyed everything. But then came something completely unexpected. 3 strips of meat, crispy and glistening, lying across the rice. The smell was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. Smoky, salty, rich with fat. Bacon, the server said in English, pointing to it. American bacon. Good. You try. Margaret stared at the strips of meat. She had heard of bacon but never tasted it. It was not part of Japanese cuisine. It looked almost burned, but the smell was intoxicating, cutting through all the familiar Japanese food smells with something entirely foreign and overwhelming. Around her, other women were receiving the same tray, the same combination of familiar and strange. They sat at the empty tables as a group, still moving together, still protecting each other. For a long moment, no one touched their food. They looked at the trays in front of them, at this abundance, at this impossible breakfast. Margaret's stomach was cramping with hunger, but her mind would not give permission to eat. This had to be drugged. This had to be poisoned. This had to be the trap. But then Grace picked up her chopsticks and took a small bite of rice. She chewed slowly, swallowed, waited. Nothing happened. She took another bite. Around the table, other women began to eat as well, tentatively at first, then with growing urgency as their bodies overrode their fears. Margaret brought rice to her mouth. It tasted clean and perfect. The miso soup warmed her throat. The pickled vegetables made her eyes water with their sharpness. The fish was real fish, not paste, not scraps. Actual fish with bones and skin and flavor. And then she tried the bacon. She picked up one strip with her chopsticks, brought it to her mouth, bit off a piece. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt and smoke and fat and something sweet underneath. Maybe sugar or maple. She could not identify it. The texture was crispy on the outside, but still had some chew, some substance. The flavor was so intense, so rich, so completely unlike anything in her experience, that her eyes widened involuntarily. Emma, sitting next to her, had just bitten into her own bacon. The 19-year-old's face transformed. Her eyes got huge. She chewed slowly as if trying to understand what was happening in her mouth. "It is," she started, then paused, then tried again. "It is so good," she said the words in Japanese, but the emotion needed no translation. Other women were having similar reactions. Some were crying while they ate, tears falling into their rice bowls. Margaret could not tell if they were crying from the food, from the memories of home that the Japanese dishes triggered, from the strangeness of the bacon, from the simple fact of abundance after so much scarcity, or from all of it combined into one overwhelming experience. She felt her own tears starting. The bacon tasted like America, like power and wealth and casual generosity, like everything the propaganda had never mentioned. Helen Park, a nurse who was 28, was eating methodically, but Margaret could see her hands shaking. Grace Watanabe had stopped eating halfway through and was just sitting with her head bowed, tears dripping onto her tray. Even Ruth Kobayashi, who had refused to wash yesterday, was eating. She ate with her face hard and angry, as if furious at herself for accepting this food. But she ate because her body gave her no choice. Private Hughes stood near the doorway watching them eat. His young face held an expression Margaret could not quite read. Not satisfaction exactly, not pity. Something more complicated. He caught Margaret looking at him and quickly looked away, as if embarrassed to be witnessing their private moment of need and gratitude and confusion. When breakfast was finished, when the trays were empty and the women sat in stunned silence, Captain James Morrison entered the mess hall with several other officers. The women tensed immediately. This was it. This was when the kindness would end and the real purpose would reveal itself. The captain stood at the front of the hall and waited for quiet. Betty Tanaka, the translator from yesterday, stepped forward. She would help with translation for official camp business, she explained again. Captain Morrison began to speak, and Betty translated his words into Japanese. "Ladies, you will work while you are here. Nothing difficult. We need assistance in several areas. The hospital, the laundry, the supply depot, the kitchen. You will work 4 hours each day from 8 in the morning until noon. In return, you will be paid." Paid. The words seemed to hang in the air like something physical. Prisoners of war were going to be paid for their work. Margaret looked around at the other women. All wore the same expression of disbelief. This had to be a mistranslation. Betty must have said the wrong word, but Betty repeated it. Paid. You will receive wages, not large wages, but enough to purchase personal items from the camp canteen. Soap, writing paper, small necessities. Captain Morrison continued. The pay is provided in military script. You can use this at the canteen to buy things you need. You will work 4 hours, then have lunch at noon. Afternoon is free time. Dinner at 6 in the evening. Lights out at 10. He paused and looked at them seriously. You are not slaves. You are not being forced to work without compensation. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention standards for prisoners of war. Does anyone have questions? No one asked anything. They were too shocked to formulate questions. Paid work, free afternoons, Geneva Convention standards. These were not terms that fit with anything they had been taught about American cruelty. Captain Morrison moved on to work assignments. Who among you has medical training, he asked. A few hands went up slowly. Helen raised hers. 2 other women did as well, Good Morrison said. You will work in the hospital. We have wounded Japanese soldiers here who need medical care, but they need nurses who can speak their language, who can help them feel less frightened. Helen's eyes widened. Japanese soldiers were here being cared for by Americans. Who can read and write English? Morrison asked next. Margaret raised her hand hesitantly. Her English was not perfect, but she had studied it in school before the war. A few other women raised hands as well. You will work in the supply depot, Morrison said. We need help organizing inventory labeling supplies in both English and Japanese so materials can be distributed properly. The remaining women were divided among laundry kitchen assistants and general maintenance. Each assignment came with clear instructions. 4 hours, paid wages, treated with respect. The captain made it sound so ordinary, so bureaucratic, as if this were a normal workplace, and they were normal employees rather than enemy prisoners. After the assignments, the women were given an hour to prepare before work began. Margaret returned to the barracks, changed back into the clean dress from yesterday, and tried to understand what was happening to her life. She was going to work in an American supply depot. She was going to be paid. She was going to eat 3 meals a day. None of this made sense with what she knew of War of Enemies, of what should happen to the defeated. At 8, Private Hughes came to collect those assigned to the supply depot. There were 5 of them total, Margaret and 4 others. He led them across the camp to a large warehouse tent filled with wooden crates and cardboard boxes stacked on pallets. Inside, the space was organized with military precision. Aisles between stacks, labels on everything, inventory sheets on clipboards hanging from posts. A middle-aged American soldier stood near a desk at the front of the warehouse. He was tall, weathered with gray hair, and a face that spoke of outdoor work and Texas sun. His name tag read Sergeant T. Walker. As they approached, another soldier called from across the warehouse. "Hey, Tex, we got another shipment rolling in." Walker raised a hand in acknowledgement. The nickname fit him perfectly, Margaret thought. Tex. Very Texas. Everything about him spoke of this place. The drawl in his voice, the weathered skin, the way he stood like he owned the ground beneath his boots. "These are your new workers," Private Hughes said. "They read and write English. Captain says, put them on inventory and labeling." Walker nodded slowly. "Right, let's see what they can do." His voice was deep, rough-edged with an accent that Margaret would later learn was distinctly Texan. He gestured for them to come closer to the desk. "This is the inventory system," he explained, speaking slowly so Betty, who had accompanied them, could keep up. "Every box that comes in gets logged. Contents, quantity, destination. Then we label it in English and Japanese so it can go where it needs to go. Some supplies go to American troops. Some go to Japanese civilians in other camps. Some go to the hospital. Everything has to be tracked so nothing gets lost." He showed them a clipboard with columns of numbers and items. "You will learn this system. You will help maintain it. Understand." Margaret looked at the inventory sheets. The system was logical, methodical. She could understand it. She nodded. "Yes, I understand." The other women nodded as well. Walker assigned them each to different sections of the warehouse and set them to work checking inventory against shipping manifests. Margaret found herself working near Walker's desk. As she checked boxes and made notes, she became aware of the sheer scale of American logistics. Box after box arrived on trucks throughout the morning. Food, medicine, clothing equipment, tools, spare parts, office supplies, cigarettes, candy, magazines. The abundance was staggering. One entire pallet was chocolate bars, Hershey bars in brown wrappers. Hundreds of them just for soldiers to eat as treats. Margaret thought of children in Japan who had not seen chocolate in years, who had not seen candy of any kind, who were eating grass and bark to survive. And here was an entire pallet of chocolate bars designated as supplemental rations for American troops who were already well fed. The contrast made her dizzy. This was the enemy. This giant with resources so vast that chocolate bars were an afterthought. Sergeant Walker noticed her staring at the chocolate pallet. "That bothers you," he said. It was not a question. Margaret looked at him, unsure how to answer. He continued, not waiting for her response. "It should bother you. It's not fair. Japan has been starving for years. We have more food than we know what to do with. War is never fair." His directness surprised her. She had expected Americans to gloat, to rub their superiority in the faces of the defeated. But Walker just sounded tired. "You're good at this work," he said after watching her for another hour. "You went to school." Margaret nodded. "In Naha. Before the war, I wanted to be a teacher." Walker pulled out his wallet and extracted a photograph. He handed it to Margaret. The photo showed a young woman in graduation robes, smiling, holding a diploma. "My daughter," Walker said, "Sarah Ann. She's studying to be a teacher too, in California." He took the photo back and returned it to his wallet carefully. Margaret stared at him. He had just shown her a photograph of his daughter. While Margaret was the enemy, while Margaret's people had attacked his country. It made no sense. Why would he do that? Why would he want her to know that he had a daughter who wanted to be a teacher, just like Margaret had wanted to be a teacher? The war is over, Walker said quietly. Maybe you can teach again when you go home. The word home landed heavy. Margaret did not know if she had a home anymore. Naha had been destroyed, her family scattered or dead. But she nodded because she did not know what else to do. She returned to checking inventory and labeling boxes, her mind spinning with questions she could not answer. At noon, a bell rang for lunch. The women returned to the mess hall. More food, more abundance, rice and vegetables and meat. Americans and Japanese eating in the same space, separated by tables but not by walls or guards or violence. Just people eating lunch. The normalcy of it was more disturbing than any torture could have been. That afternoon, Margaret had free time as promised. She returned to the barracks and tried to rest, but sleep would not come. Around her, other women were having quiet conversations, processing what they were experiencing. Emma was sitting on her cot, holding the cloth bag that contained her razor blade. She looked at it for a long time, then tucked it under her pillow. Not thrown away yet, but not carried on her person anymore either. Helen came in from her first shift at the hospital. Her face was pale, shocked. The other women gathered around her. What did you see? Grace asked. Helen sat down heavily on her cot. Japanese soldiers, she said, wounded from the battle, some from Okinawa, some from other islands, being treated by American doctors. Real treatment. Surgery, antibiotics, clean bandages, pain medicine, everything. She described one soldier in particular. His name was Takeshi Ishida, Private Takeshi Ishida, 19 years old. He had been burned by a flamethrower. His arms and chest a massive scar tissue and healing wounds. The American doctors had saved his life with surgeries and skin grafts and constant care. But Ishida was not grateful. He was crying not from physical pain, but from shame. He kept saying the same words over and over. I should have died. I should have died with honor. Why did you save me? Why did you care? Helen had watched Dr. Kate Martinez, the same doctor who had examined Margaret treating Ishida's wounds. Martinez had been so gentle, so patient. Through the translator, she had told Ishida, every life is valuable. American, Japanese, it does not matter. We are doctors. We save lives. That is what we do. But her words only made Ishida cry harder. He could not accept kindness from the enemy. He could not reconcile what he had been taught with what he was experiencing. I understand how he feels, Helen said quietly. I do not know how to make sense of this either. We were taught that Americans were monsters without honor or mercy, but what I saw today was mercy. Pure mercy. They did not have to save him. They did not have to care for his pain. But they did. Why did they do that? No one had an answer. Ruth Kobayashi sat on her cot with her arms crossed. It is still a trick, she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. They want something from us. They want us to betray Japan. Grace shook her head. Betray Japan. How? By accepting medicine, by eating their food, by acknowledging that they treat us well. If that is betrayal, then we are all traitors already. The argument was interrupted by Private Hughes appearing at the door. He held a bundle of letters. Mail call, he said through Betty, who had accompanied him. Red Cross has started facilitating letters between prisoners and families in Japan. These are the first batch. Not everyone has letters yet. Mail service is still disrupted. But these came through. He began calling names. Grace Watanabe, Emma Liu, Margaret Hayashi, Ruth Kobayashi. Each woman who heard her name came forward to receive an envelope. Margaret's hand shook as she took hers. The envelope was thin, the paper cheap, wartime stock. Her mother's handwriting on the front. Margaret returned to her cot and held the letter for a long moment before opening it. She was afraid of what it would say, afraid of what news it would bring from a home that no longer existed. Finally, she opened it. The letter was short. Her mother's handwriting was shakier than Margaret remembered, as if written by an old woman, though her mother was only 50. Dearest Margaret, we received word that you are alive and in American custody. This brought us joy even in our sorrow. Life here is very hard. Kumamoto was bombed many times. There is little food. We eat sweet potatoes and whatever we can find in the fields. Your father died in February. He was caught in a bombing raid while trying to find food. I am sorry you have to learn this way. Your brother David is still missing. We have had no word of him since Okinawa fell. I fear the worst, but still pray for a miracle. I am glad you are alive, my daughter. That is all that matters now. Please come home when you can. I need you. Your mother. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and pressed it against her chest. Her father was dead. Her brother was missing, probably dead. Her mother was alone and starving. And Margaret was here, thousands of miles away, eating bacon for breakfast and sleeping in a clean cot and earning money to buy soap. The guilt crashed over her like a physical weight. Around her, other women were reading their own letters. Grace was crying, clutching a letter from her aunt about her children. The children are hungry, Grace read aloud. They ask for you every day. They do not understand where you are or why you have not come home. Emma had received a letter from a family friend confirming what she had feared. Her parents were both dead killed in the bombings. She sat very still, the letter in her lap, her face blank. Ruth's letter was perhaps the cruelest. Her husband had been killed at Iwo Jima. Her mother-in-law had written the letter and the words were harsh. You should have died with honor rather than be captured by the enemy. You bring shame to our family by surviving by accepting American charity. My son died a hero and you live as a coward. Do not come home. You are no longer welcome here. Ruth read the letter aloud in a flat voice, then folded it and placed it carefully in her box. No one knew what to say. The silence stretched out heavy with grief and guilt and impossible complexity. They were safe. Their families were suffering. They were eating well. Their families were starving. They were receiving medical care. Their families were dying of treatable diseases. The unfairness of it was crushing. That night, the women gathered in the barracks for what would become a nightly ritual of discussion and debate. They sat on their cots or on the floor between them, forming a circle. Someone always started by asking the same question in different forms. Why are they doing this? What do they want from us? What is the purpose of this kindness? Eleanor spoke first. In the hospital today, I watched Americans saving Japanese soldiers who tried to kill them only months ago. I watched Dr. Martinez treat Ishida's burns as carefully as she would treat her own son. There was no hatred in her face, only concentration, only the desire to heal. Is that weakness or strength? It must be weakness, Ruth has said. They are soft. They cannot kill their enemies properly. They cannot commit to total war. That is why they will ultimately fail despite their material advantages. But even as she said it, she did not sound convinced. Grace disagreed. I think it is strength. It takes no strength to be cruel. Any coward can torture a helpless prisoner. But to show mercy, to treat enemies with dignity, that requires strength of character. That requires belief in something bigger than revenge. She paused. We were taught that Bushido, the way of the warrior, meant dying for the emperor. But these Americans have shown us a different code. One where life is sacred, where even enemy lives matter. Emma, the youngest, spoke up. This morning I tasted bacon for the first time. It was so good, so rich, and then I felt ashamed for enjoying it while my parents are dead, while people in Japan are starving. But the Americans did not force me to eat it. They just offered it. They shared their abundance without demanding anything in return. I do not understand that kind of generosity. Margaret had been quiet, but now she spoke. In the supply depot today, Sergeant Walker showed me a photo of his daughter. She wants to be a teacher, like I wanted to be a teacher. He did not have to show me that. He did not have to let me know he has a daughter, that he is a father, that he is a person with a family and hopes and dreams. But he did. Why, what did he want me to understand? Maybe he wanted you to see him as human, Grace said softly, and by extension to see all Americans as human. Because if we see them as human, then we have to confront what we did, what our country did, what we believed. The words hung in the air. What Japan had done. It was not spoken explicitly, but they all knew. They had heard rumors, stories from soldiers who came back from China. Whispers about massacres, about comfort women, about brutality that made their blood run cold. They had dismissed these as enemy propaganda or regrettable necessities of war. But now, experiencing American mercy firsthand, they had to ask themselves, if Americans were not the monsters they had been told, what did that make Japan's actions? What did that make their own complicity? Ruth suddenly broke down. Her hard facade crumbled, and she sobbed like a child. My husband died believing he was fighting demons. He died thinking Japan was protecting Asia from American monsters. He died convinced that capture by Americans meant torture and death. She could not continue for a moment. The women waited. But they are not monsters, Ruth said. They are human beings. They have families. They have photographs of their tutors. They give chocolate bars to enemy prisoners. They are better than we were, so much better. The confession hung in the air. No one moved to comfort her immediately because they were all feeling the same crushing realization. If the Americans were not evil, then what did that make Japan? What did that make all the deaths? What did that make them? Margaret wrote in her diary that night by the light from the window. September 22nd, 1945. Second week in American camp. 1 week since arrival. Father is dead. David is missing. Mother is alone and starving. And I am here, safe and fed and cared for. The guilt is worse than any torture could be. Today I tasted bacon. Today I saw abundance beyond imagining. Today Sergeant Walker showed me his daughter's photograph. Every moment of kindness makes me question everything I believed. If the Americans are not monsters, then what were we fighting? If they show mercy to their enemies, what does that make us who showed none? The propaganda said they would experiment on us. Instead, they heal us. The propaganda said they would starve us. Instead, they feed us bacon and rice. The propaganda said they were devils. Instead, they are just people. Flawed, tired, sometimes awkward people trying to do the right thing. I do not know what to believe anymore, but my hands are healing. The medicine works. The food is real. The kindness continues. And that terrifies me more than bombs ever did. Because if I accept this kindness, if I admit they are good, then I have to face what we were. And I am not ready for that. Not yet. She closed the diary and lay back on her cot. Around her, women were settling in for the night. Some were still crying quietly. Others were praying. Emma had finally taken the razor blade out of the cloth bag and was looking at it. Margaret watched as the young woman held the blade up to the light, examined it for a long moment, then slipped it back into the bag and placed the bag under her pillow. Not thrown away, but not needed tonight. Maybe not needed tomorrow either. Maybe never needed at all. The second week began with the distribution of wages. Captain Morrison called the women to the administration building, where small envelopes waited, each containing military scrip payment for their labor. Margaret held her envelope and felt the coins and paper inside. Money. The enemy was paying her to work. She opened it carefully. $5 in scrip. Not much by American standards, Betty explained, but enough to buy necessities at the canteen. The canteen was a small store near the center of camp shelves, stocked with items that seemed impossible to Margaret. Real soap in paper wrappers, toothbrushes with firm bristles, writing paper and pencils, handkerchiefs made of actual cotton, small mirrors, combs, and luxury items that made her dizzy just looking at them. Hard candy in glass jars, chocolate bars, chewing gum, cigarettes, magazines with glossy covers showing smiling women in beautiful dresses. The Japanese women moved through the aisles like they were in a dream. Grace bought writing paper and pencils so she could write longer letters to her children. Emma purchased a bar of lavender-scented soap and stood there in the middle of the store, smelling it, tears running down her face. Ruth bought only the most basic necessities, a bar of plain soap and a toothbrush. Her face set in hard lines as if punishing herself for even this small participation in American commerce. Margaret bought a new notebook to replace the one she was filling with diary entries and 2 pencils and a small mirror. She looked at her reflection in the mirror for the first time in months. The face that looked back was both familiar and strange. Thinner than she remembered, older, but cleaner, now healthier. The infections on her skin were healing. Her hair was no longer matted. She looked like a person again, rather than a cave-dwelling ghost. At the counter, the American soldier, ringing up their purchases, smiled at them. "You ladies need anything else, you just let us know," he said through Betty. "We try to stock what you ask for." The casual friendliness in his voice was still jarring. This was not how conquerors were supposed to speak to the conquered. This was how shopkeepers spoke to customers. The normalcy of it created a cognitive dissonance that Margaret could not resolve. Work became routine. Every morning, Margaret reported to the supply depot where Sergeant Walker assigned her tasks. One morning during the second week, a shipment arrived that stopped Margaret cold. Medical supplies bound for Tokyo. Crates and crates of antibiotics, bandages, surgical instruments, anesthesia, all labeled for Japanese civilian relief MacArthur directive. Margaret checked the manifest carefully, certain she was misreading it. But no, the destination was clear. American medicine being sent to help Japanese civilians. The enemy was sending medicine to help the people who had attacked them. Walker noticed her confusion. "That bothers you," he said. It was becoming his standard observation whenever Margaret encountered something that contradicted her understanding of how war should work. Margaret looked at him directly for the first time. "Why are you doing this?" she asked in her careful English. "Japan attacked you, killed your people. Why help us now?" Walker was quiet for a long moment. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it, took a long drag, exhaled smoke toward the tent ceiling. "General MacArthur's orders," he said finally. "Can't rebuild Japan if everyone's dead from typhoid and starvation. Practical, not sentimental. Dead people can't work, can't rebuild, can't become trading partners. Someday." He paused, looking at Margaret. "But yeah, there's more to it than that." He tapped ash off his cigarette. "My cousin died at Pearl Harbor. He was on the Arizona, 22 years old. Bobby, going to come work on my ranch after the war. Never got that chance. So yeah, I got reason to hate Japan, got plenty of reason." He looked at Margaret directly. "But what does hating you accomplish? You didn't bomb Pearl Harbor. You're just a girl who wanted to be a teacher. Hating you doesn't bring Bobby back. Doesn't change anything." He took another drag. "Your country is very rich," you said yesterday. "That's true, and you know why. Because our farms weren't bombed. Our factories kept running. Our children didn't starve. We got lucky in geography. Oceans protected us. But that luck comes with responsibility." Margaret struggled to understand. Responsibility to who? "To everyone," Walker said. "Power without responsibility is just bullying. Real strength means helping when you could hurt instead. Means choosing mercy when you got every right to choose vengeance." He crushed out his cigarette. "Besides, your mother didn't start this war. Neither did you. My daughter Sarah Ann, she writes me letters. She says we got to build a better world after this. Can't build a better world if we just keep killing each other forever." He pulled a chocolate bar from his desk drawer, a Hershey bar in its familiar brown wrapper. The paper was warm, softened from being in his desk. "Send this to your mother," he said, handing it to Margaret. "Tell her a Texas cattle rancher wanted her to have it. Tell her that not all Americans are enemies. Just most of us were on different sides for a while. But that's over now." Margaret took the chocolate bar with shaking hands. The wrapper was warm from being in his desk, softened slightly. She could feel the chocolate bar inside, solid and real. This small rectangle represented so much. American abundance. American generosity. An enemy caring about another enemy's starving mother. She looked at Walker and could not speak. Her throat had closed with emotion she could not name. Finally, she managed two words. "Thank you." He waved it off. "You do good work. You show up on time. You check inventory careful. You deserve to be paid decent and treated decent. That's all. Now get back to labeling those boxes. We got a shipment going out this afternoon." That afternoon, after work hours ended, something unexpected happened. A group of American soldiers had set up a baseball diamond on a flat stretch of ground near the barracks. Private Hughes noticed the Japanese women watching from a distance and jogged over. "You want to watch?" he asked through Betty. "We're just playing for fun, not official or anything. You can sit on the bleachers." The women followed him to a set of wooden bleachers. The Americans ignored them, mostly focused on their game. Betty explained the rules as they played. The crack of the bat, the cheering, the casual competition. It was so ordinary, so peaceful. When the game ended, Hughes brought Emma down to home plate. He handed her a bat, showed her how to hold it. The other soldiers gathered around, offering encouragement. "Choke up on the bat. Keep your eye on the ball. Swing level." Emma swung twice and missed. On the third pitch, she made contact. A weak grounder that dribbled toward third base. But the Americans cheered as if she had hit a home run. "Good hit," Hughes called. "You're a natural." Emma was laughing, actually laughing, a sound Margaret had not heard from her since before the battle. The other Japanese women were smiling too, watching this impossible scene. Enemy soldiers teaching a Japanese girl to play baseball in the Texas sun. The following evening brought music. Someone in the American quarters had a radio, and they set it up in the common area. Soldiers gathered around as big band music poured out of the speaker. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, the sounds of swing and jazz that had defined the American home front during the war years. Then something remarkable happened. One of the soldiers fiddled with the radio dial, searching for a different station. Static hissed and crackled. Then suddenly, impossibly, a Japanese song came through the speaker. Sakura, Sakura, the cherry blossom song. Traditional, familiar, a melody that every Japanese person knew from childhood. The effect on the women was immediate and profound. They moved closer to the radio as if drawn by gravity. Some began to cry before the first verse even finished. Others hummed along the melody, unlocking memories of Japan before the war. Spring festivals, cherry trees in bloom, a world that seemed to belong to a different universe now. Grace was weeping openly, her hands pressed to her mouth. This was the song her children loved. She had sung it to them countless times. Ruth stood very still, tears running down her cheeks, but her face rigid, fighting the emotion even as it overwhelmed her. Helen swayed slightly, eyes closed, transported somewhere else entirely. When the song ended, the soldier at the radio did not change the station. He let the Japanese programming continue. Another song, then another. Traditional melodies that spoke of mountains and rivers and seasons and home. The soldiers drifted away, gradually giving the women space for their grief. But they did not turn off the radio. They left it playing. This gift of sound. This connection to everything the women had lost. Private Hughes was the last American to leave. He lingered near the radio, watching Margaret specifically. Finally, he approached her carefully. That song, he said through Betty, who had stayed behind. It's beautiful. Very sad, but beautiful. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Hughes continued. I lost someone too. My brother, 3 months ago, at Okinawa. He was 21, wanted to be a veterinarian, take care of animals. He showed Margaret a photograph from his wallet, a young man in uniform smiling, posing with a dog. Tommy Hughes, he said. That was his name. Margaret looked at the photograph and felt something crack open inside her. Your brother died dead on Okinawa, she said slowly. I was on Okinawa. Maybe he died near where I was hiding. Maybe I heard the bombs that killed him. The realization settled between them, heavy and impossible. They were connected by geography and death and the random chance of war. Hughes was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I should hate you. Your people killed Tommy, killed my brother who never hurt anyone in his life, who just wanted to help sick animals when he got home. He looked down at the photograph in his hand. But I've been watching you these past weeks. I've seen you cry over letters from home, seen you work harder than you need to, seen you trying so hard to understand why we're being kind when you expected cruelty. He looked up at Margaret. Tommy wouldn't want me to hate you. That wasn't who he was. He paused. And that's not who I want to be either. Margaret felt her own eyes burning. I should hate you too. Your bombs killed my father, destroyed my city. My brother nearly died because of American weapons. She struggled to find words in English that were difficult enough in Japanese. But you are not your bombs. You are William Hughes from Oklahoma, who lost his brother. And I am Margaret Hayashi from Okinawa, who lost her father. We are both just grieving, just trying to survive what others decided for us. Hughes nodded slowly. Yeah, that's exactly right. We didn't choose this war, but maybe we can choose what happens after. He pulled out a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, offered her one. Margaret shook her head. I don't smoke, neither do I really, Hughes said. Just seems like the thing to offer. They both laughed, a short bark of sound that was half laugh, half sob. The moment broke some invisible barrier between them. They stood there in the Texas evening, listening to Japanese music pour from an American radio. Two young people on opposite sides of the biggest war in history, finding common ground and shared grief. The third week ended with news that shook the camp. Another batch of letters arrived from the Red Cross. Margaret received one that was not from her mother, but from an official source. Red Cross notification. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed information. Name David Hayashi, status alive. Location, POW Camp Manzanar, California. Condition stable. Receiving medical care. Allowed to send and receive mail. David was alive. Her brother was alive. Not missing. Not dead. Alive in California, being cared for by Americans just like she was being cared for in Texas. The relief was so overwhelming that Margaret's legs gave out and she sat down hard on the ground. Around her, other women gathered. "What is it? What does it say?" Margaret could barely speak. "My brother, he's alive. In California, the Americans saved him too." The realization hit all of them at once. This was not isolated. This was not just their camp. This was American policy across the entire Pacific. Save prisoners, care for them, treat them humanely, feed them, give them medical attention. It was systemic kindness, institutional mercy, a country that had been attacked choosing to respond with humanity rather than revenge. That night, Margaret wrote a long letter to her mother. She included the chocolate bar from Walker carefully wrapped. She told her mother about the camp, about the food, about the medical care. She told her about David being alive. And then she wrote the hardest part. "Mother, everything we were told about the Americans was wrong. They are not cruel. They are not monsters. They treat us with dignity and kindness. They feed us. They pay us for our work. They care for our sick and wounded. I know this is hard to hear. I know you will not want to believe it. But it is true. The enemy has shown me more humanity than our own government did in the final year of the war. I do not know what this means. I do not know how to make sense of it. But I thought you should know. Your daughter, Margaret." She sealed the letter and gave it to Private Hughes to mail. He took it with a small smile. "Your mom is going to be happy to hear from you," he said. "And real happy about that chocolate. Walker is a good man." Margaret nodded. "Yes, he is a good man. And you are a good man too, Private Hughes. You could hate us. You have every reason. But you choose kindness instead. That takes real strength." Hughes looked uncomfortable with the compliment. "Just doing what Tommy would have wanted me to do," he mumbled. He walked away quickly, but Margaret saw him wipe at his eyes. On October 15th, exactly 1 month after their arrival, the women were called to a special meeting. Captain Morrison stood at the front of the mess hall, his face serious. "Ladies," he began, and Betty translated carefully. "We need to talk about your future." The words sent a chill through the room. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. Your country is under occupation, now being rebuilt. At some point you will be repatriated, sent home to Japan. Home. The word carried so much weight. Home to what? To rubble, to starving families, to shame. But before that happens, Morrison continued, "We want to give you a choice." A choice. Prisoners were being given a choice. "We need civilian workers to help with reconstruction efforts in Okinawa and eventually on the mainland. The work would be voluntary. You would be paid fair wages, not prisoner wages. You would have more freedom, though you would still be under our authority until the occupation ends." He paused. "Or you can choose to go home now. We are arranging transport for civilians who want to return to their families immediately. The choice is yours. No one will be forced to work for us. No one will be punished for choosing to go home. This is your decision. Take until the end of the week to decide." That night, the barracks was filled with urgent conversation. Stay and work for the Americans or go home to a devastated Japan. Ruth was adamant. "I am going home. I will not work for the enemy. No matter how they have treated us, I am Japanese. Japan is my place." Most of the younger women were torn. Emma said quietly, "If I go home now, what will I find? My house was destroyed. My parents are dead. What kind of life waits for me there? But at least it's Japan. At least it's home." Grace had a different concern. "My children are waiting. I have to go home. But I'm afraid. Afraid they won't understand why I survived. Afraid they'll be ashamed of me." Helen said, "I'm staying. The hospital needs nurses. Japanese wounded are still being brought in. If I can help them, if I can bridge the gap between Americans and Japanese, maybe I can do some good." Everyone looked at Margaret. She had been quiet through dinner and through the first hour of debate. Now she pulled out her notebook and looked at all the entries she had made over the past month. "I have been writing everything down," she said slowly. "Every kindness, every moment of confusion, every time reality contradicted what we were taught. I have a record here of a month spent with the enemy, a month that destroyed everything I believed about them." She closed the notebook. "I am going home, not because I hate the Americans, Not because I am ashamed I survived, but because someone needs to tell the truth. Someone needs to say that the Americans treated us with dignity, that everything we were told was a lie. She looked around the circle. If we all stay here, if we all hide in Texas working for them who will tell the people in Japan the truth, the words settled over the room. Margaret was right. Someone had to witness. Someone had to carry the truth back. Grace nodded slowly. You're right. I will go home too, to my children, and I will tell them what happened here. Ruth, who had been silent, finally spoke. I will go home, but I don't know if I can tell the truth. I don't know if anyone will listen. They will listen eventually, Margaret said. The truth always finds a way. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Those who chose to stay said their goodbyes to those who were leaving. 22 women would return to Japan. 10 would stay in Texas to continue working. On Margaret's last day at the supply depot, Walker called her into his office. He handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. Open it, he said. Inside was a new notebook larger than the one she carried, blank pages waiting to be filled, and 3 pencils sharp and ready. Keep writing, Walker said. Write about what happened here. Write about going home. Write the truth. People need to hear it. Some people won't want to hear it. Some will call you a traitor for saying anything good about Americans. But say it anyway. The truth matters more than comfort. Margaret held the notebook like it was made of gold. I will. I promise I will tell them what you did for us. Walker smiled. We didn't do anything special. We just treated you like human beings. That shouldn't be special. But I guess in war, basic decency becomes extraordinary. He extended his hand. Good luck, Margaret Hayashi. I hope you get to be that teacher you wanted to be. Margaret shook his hand. Thank you, Sergeant Walker. Thank you for everything, for the chocolate, for showing me your daughter's photograph, for teaching me that enemies can become friends. Dr. Martinez came to see her as well. She checked Margaret's hands one last time. Completely healed, she said, smiling. You're healthy now, strong, ready for whatever comes next. Margaret asked in English, Dr. Martinez, why you help us? Martinez looked at her with those kind, tired eyes. Because you needed help. That's enough reason. She squeezed Margaret's hand. The war made everyone believe terrible things about each other. But now the war is over. Now we have a chance to see each other clearly, as human beings. That's what peace means, Margaret. Seeing each other's humanity. Private Hughes brought extra rations for the journey, for the train ride, he said. He looked like he wanted to say more but could not find the words. Finally, he just said, take care of yourself and tell your students someday. Tell them what you learned here. Tell them that hate doesn't have to be forever. On October 20th, 1945, the truck carried 22 Japanese women away from Camp Swift. Margaret looked back at the camp through the dusty rear window. She could see Walker standing outside the supply depot, hand raised in farewell. She could see Dr. Martinez near the hospital tent. She could see Private Hughes by the gate. These Americans who had shown her mercy when she expected cruelty, who had given her hope when she expected death, who had proven that enemies could be human. The journey back to Japan took 3 weeks. Ship to California, ship across the Pacific. The women spent the voyage writing letters, preparing themselves for what waited at home. Margaret filled page after page of her new notebook, documenting everything, making sure the truth would survive, even if she did not. When the ship docked in Japan, Margaret saw immediately how much worse the devastation was than she had imagined. The port city had been heavily bombed. Buildings were collapsed or burned. The docks were crowded with refugees, displaced civilians, orphaned children. American soldiers were everywhere, part of the occupation force. They directed traffic, distributed supplies, managed the crowds. The sight of American uniforms on Japanese soil was jarring, even though Margaret had just spent a month surrounded by those same uniforms. Japanese civilians looked at the Americans with a mixture of fear, resentment, and desperate hope. These were the conquerors, but they were also the ones with food and medicine. Margaret understood that complexity now in a way she never could have before Texas. She took a train south toward Kumamoto. The journey showed her the full scope of the destruction. City after city had been bombed. The countryside was a little better, but even there people looked thin and desperate. Children pressed against the train windows begging for food. Margaret found her mother living in a single room in what had once been a school building. The house they had lived in was gone destroyed in a bombing raid. Her mother looked 20 years older than her actual age. Thin bent her hair almost completely white. But when she saw Margaret, she collapsed to her knees and wept. My daughter is alive." They held each other for a long time. Then Margaret pulled out the care package she had brought. Soap medicine in the chocolate bar from Walker, still wrapped carefully. Her mother stared at the items. "Where did you get these?" "The Americans gave them to me," Margaret said carefully. "When I was in the camp, they treated us well." Her mother's face changed, became hard. "You accepted gifts from the enemy. You should have died rather than be captured. That's what a Japanese woman should do. Die with honor." The words cut deeper than any blade. Margaret felt her carefully maintained composure crack. "The Americans didn't give us a chance to die, Mother. They just kept saving us. They gave us hot water and soap and medicine and kindness. Everything we were told about them was a lie." Her mother looked away. "Don't say such things. It's treason. People will hear you. They'll think you're a collaborator." Margaret's voice was firm. "It's truth, and I'm going to keep saying it because someone has to. The lie killed Father. The lie nearly killed David. The lie destroyed Japan. I will not keep lying just because the truth is uncomfortable." Her mother was silent for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Your brother wrote to me from California. He said the same things you're saying, that the Americans treated him well, that everything we were taught was wrong." She looked at Margaret. "I don't know what to believe anymore. Everything I knew is gone. The emperor said we were divine. The government said we couldn't lose. The military said the Americans were demons. All lies, all of it." "Not all lies," Margaret said gently. "Japan is still our home. Our language, our culture, our family, those things are real. But the idea that we were superior, that conquest was our destiny, that enemies were not human, those were lies. And we have to stop believing them." Her mother began to cry, quiet tears that spoke of decades of propaganda finally crumbling. "I'm glad you're alive," she whispered. "I'm glad you came home, even if I don't understand everything, even if it frightens me. I'm glad." Margaret held her mother and felt something settle inside her. This was why she had come home. Not to bring comfort, not to pretend everything was fine, but to bring truth. Hard truth. Painful truth. Truth that could build something better than lies ever could. The months passed slowly. Margaret helped her mother survive and occupy Japan. She saw American soldiers distributing food medicine supplies. She saw Japanese children learning to play baseball from American troops. She saw the same patterns she had experienced in Texas playing out across an entire nation. The enemy showing mercy, choosing reconstruction over revenge. In 1948, 3 years after her return, Margaret achieved her dream. She became a teacher at a school in Kumamoto. On her first day, she stood before a classroom of children who had grown up during the war. Children who had been taught the same lies she had believed. Children who needed the truth. "I'm going to tell you about my experience during the war," she began. "And it's going to challenge everything you think you know. But I need you to listen, because the truth is the only thing that can prevent this from happening again." She told them about Okinawa, about the coincidental, about the capture, about expecting torture and receiving kindness instead, about hot water and soap and bacon and chocolate, about Dr. Martinez wrapping her hands, about Walker giving her a chocolate bar for her mother, about Private Hughes who lost his brother but chose mercy over hate, about coming home and being rejected for speaking truth. The students listened in stunned silence. Some looked skeptical, others looked frightened, a few looked angry, but they all listened, and that was what mattered. The truth was being told. The next generation was hearing it. Over the years, Margaret taught thousands of students. She never stopped telling her story. She never stopped emphasizing the same message. Enemies are human. Mercy is stronger than vengeance. Truth is more important than comfortable lies. The cycle of hatred can be broken if enough people choose to break it. In 1955, 10 years after Camp Swift, Margaret had a daughter. She named her Yuki. Courage. One evening when Yuki was 5 years old, she asked the question children always ask, "Mama, why did the war happen?" Margaret pulled out the old notebook from Texas, the one Walker had given her. Its pages were yellowed now, but the words were still clear. She opened it to the first page. September 15th, 1945. First day in American Camp, Texas. They gave us hot water. She read the entry aloud to Yuki. Then she explained. The war happened because people stopped seeing each other as human, because we believed lies about enemies, because we thought we were superior and others were inferior, because we chose hate over understanding. Yuki listened carefully. But the Americans were nice to you, she said, even though you were enemies. Why, Margaret smiled. That's the most important question. They were nice to us because they believe that every person has value, that even enemies deserve dignity, that the way to win a peace is different from the way to win a war. They taught me that enemies don't have to stay enemies forever, that people can change, that nations can change, that the future doesn't have to repeat the past. Yuki touched the notebook gently. Will you give this to me someday? Margaret nodded. Yeah. Someday this will be yours, and you'll understand why it matters, why truth matters, why kindness matters, why seeing each other as human matters. She closed the notebook. The hardest lesson I ever learned was that everything I had been taught was wrong. The Americans were not demons. We were not superior. War was not glorious. But the second hardest lesson was even more important. People can change. Countries can change. The future does not have to repeat the past. She looked at her daughter. They told us to close our eyes and not scream. They told us to expect torture. They told us to, rather than accept enemy mercy. But what we should have been told was this: open your eyes, see clearly, accept truth even when it hurts, because truth is the only foundation for real peace. Yuki was quiet for a moment. Then she said, when I grow up, I want to be a teacher like you. I want to tell true stories too. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. That would make me very proud. That night, Margaret made her final entry in the Texas notebook. October 20th, 1955. 10 years since I left Camp Swift. Today, my daughter said she wants to be a teacher. She wants to tell true stories. The truth I brought home from Texas has taken root. It's growing. It's spreading. That's how peace really works. Not through treaties or governments or grand gestures, but through individuals choosing truth over lies, choosing to see enemies as human, choosing mercy over hate. Close your eyes and don't scream. That's what we told ourselves that first day, but we should have been told this. Open your eyes, open your hearts, see clearly. Because the Americans showed us something that day in Texas. They showed us that kindness is not weakness, that mercy is not surrender, that seeing enemies as human is not betrayal. It is the only way forward. It is the only way to build something better. That is my legacy. That is what I will leave to my daughter and her children and all the children who come after. The truth is simple. The enemy showed us more humanity than our own side ever did in those final months. That's painful to admit, but admitting it is the only way to build something better. That's what I learned in Texas. That's what I'll teach until my last breath. Open your eyes. See clearly. Choose truth. Choose mercy. Choose to be human to each other. That's how wars end. That's how peace begins. That's how the future becomes different from the past. She closed the notebook for the last time and looked out the window at the Kumamoto night. Somewhere in Texas, Sergeant Walker was probably working his ranch. Dr. Martinez was probably treating patients. Private Hughes was probably living the life his brother Tommy never got to live. They had given her more than hot water and soap and medicine. They had given her a different way to see the world. A better way. A way built on human dignity rather than national pride. On mercy rather than vengeance. On truth rather than propaganda. That was the real victory. Not the military victory that ended the war, but the personal victory that could prevent the next one. The victory of choosing to see enemies as human. The victory of accepting uncomfortable truth. The victory of building bridges instead of walls. Close your eyes and don't scream. That was fear speaking. Open your eyes and see clearly. That was courage. And courage, Margaret had learned, was not about dying for your country. It was about living for the truth. Even when the truth hurt. Even when the truth was rejected. Even when the truth made you an outcast. Because the truth was the only thing worth fighting for. The only thing worth dying for. The only thing worth living for. And Margaret Hayashi, formerly a frightened girl hiding in Okinawa caves, now a teacher in post-war Japan, had found her truth in the most unlikely place, in the mercy of enemies, in the kindness of conquerors, in a prison camp in Texas where Americans proved that humanity could survive even the worst of wars. That was the story she would tell until her last breath. That was the legacy she would leave. That was the truth that would outlive her. Open your eyes. See clearly. Choose mercy. Be human to each other. That's how wars end. That's how peace begins. That's the only way forward.